I'm going to build on those wonderful talks that you've just heard from Emily, Precious, and Diane by talking to you about the most important institution in our lives. I'm not talking about the state, religion, or TEDx. I'm talking to you about an institution that clothes, feeds, and houses us, that employs us, and invests our savings. It's the source of economic prosperity and the growth of nations around the world. But at the same time, the corporation has been the source of terrible deprivation, poverty, and environmental degradation. And it's destroying our systems. It's destroying our environmental systems, as we saw in the case of Fukushima in the Gulf of Mexico. It's destroying our financial systems, as we observed during the financial crisis. And because those bankrupt banks then had to be bailed out by the rest of the economy, it's also been destroying our economies. But the multinational corporations are worse. They're exploiting us by paying a pittance to the poorest people in the world, by employing them in sweatshops that turn into infernos, and by then paying virtually no taxes on the huge profits that they make. But worst of all, of course, are the banks. They defraud us by selling us products we don't want, such as payments protection, insurance, or don't need. They manipulate our markets, like the foreign exchange markets and LIBOR. And then they pay themselves outrageous salaries, egregious salaries, for the good work that they're doing. The corporation is inherently evil. And we, the customers, employees, and communities of the world are the victims of it. We have no control on the economic forces that give rise to this, and we are as powerless as we are over the laws of motion and the seasons of the year. Well, I'm going to suggest to you that that view that the corporation is inherently evil is fundamentally wrong. It hasn't always been so, it needn't be so, and it will not be so, provided that we recognize that we have to reinvent the corporation for the 21st century. And provided that you realize that we can all bring about that transformation. Some of the most successful corporations in the world are Bertelsmann, the media company, Carlsberg, the brewery, IKEA, the furniture retailer, Velux, the window manufacturer, Tata, the Indian conglomerate. All of them have one thing in common. They are all owned by industrial foundations. Those foundations give a majority of their profits to charities. But it's not that philanthropic element that I really want to emphasize now. More significantly, the boards of those foundations are responsible for ensuring that the companies below them, like Carlsberg, uphold the values of the founders. And if they fail to do so, then it's the directors of those boards who take responsibility for it. They are not the only examples of enlightened corporations. In 1947, Forrest Mars, the son of Frank Mars, the founder of Mars Incorporated, the chocolate manufacturer, laid down a set of principles by which the company should be run. Included in them was the notion of mutuality, that the benefits of the business should be shared between all parties, from the producers, the cocoa producers, through the employees to the distributors. And it's a principle of mutuality that the company is now firmly pursuing. And of course, Britain led the way in this regard, with companies like Bourneville, Cadbury, Boots, Beecham, Rowntree's, Terry's, Fry's, Macintosh, mainly Quaker companies that had strong underlying principles as to how those companies should be run. We may have led the way, but we've lost the way. And two companies that illustrate this particularly well are Barclays Bank and Lehman Brothers. Not the Barclays Bank and Lehman Brothers of today, but their 17th century and 19th century versions, respectively. Mayor Lehman, the founder of Lehman Brothers, would take his children every weekend to the Mount Sinai Hospital to show them the worst off members of New York society. John Freed, who founded Barclays Bank in 1690, wrote Scripture Instruction, a text that was used for more than 100 years in Quaker schools. Those corporations that were founded by entrepreneurs with real strong principles and values have over time come to be owned and controlled by shareholders and executives who are interested in one thing and one thing alone: making money. Well, what should we do about it? There are three things that I think we should do about it. The 3 R's. We should reinvent the corporation. We should redesign regulation. And we should re-establish the corporate contract between government and business. One feature which unified those successful, enlightened corporations of yesterday and today was the fact that they had strong underlying purposes. And those purposes were not to produce profits. Their purposes were to do things, to make goods and services that benefit us as customers and communities, and to look after the welfare and well-being of their workforce. And in the process of doing that, they thereby generated profits. But profits were not the purpose of those corporations. And any successful corporation knows that to be the case. But we've lost the way with too many of our corporations, and we need to transmit that message through public media and social media. And we need to transform the types of institutions in which I work, in a business school in Oxford. Because typically, the first course of an MBA program will tell students that the purpose of a corporation is to maximize shareholder value. And everything else in the rest of the course then flows from that. Well, that is not correct. The first course should be, what are the purposes of the corporation and what should its values be? And then the rest of the course should flow from that. Now, unfortunately, not all corporations are that enlightened. And we should not find ourselves abused by those that are not. We should have much tougher enforcement of public laws regarding bribery, corruption, market manipulation, and environmental degradation. But we should also expect much more from our corporations than they just meet those minimum standards. I sit on a government committee called the Natural Capital Committee. And the purpose of that committee, which was established by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, is to try and enhance, not degrade, our natural capital so that for the first time we leave it in a better state for future generations than we found it. Now, one of the key elements of that is to measure performance appropriately. At the Rio Summit in 2013, the British government committed to producing national accounts which incorporated natural capital and the environment in them. Because the underlying problem is that at present, we are failing to take account of the way in which we are degrading our environment in the form in which we measure income. We should take account of the cost of sustaining and maintaining our natural capital. And that should not only apply to corporations and the nation, it should apply to business as well. Because business is as much misstating its profits and income as the nation is in terms of its national income. Companies should only be able to declare profits net of the cost of their maintaining the natural capital for which they are responsible. But it doesn't just apply to natural capital. Britain also led the way in terms of social reform at the beginning of the 19th century in terms of protecting workers in factories through, for example, the Factories Act at the beginning of the 19th century. But now what's happening is that corporations are circumventing that regulation by employing people in countries where such legislation does not apply, through, for example, outsourcing to other parts of the world. Well, that's outrageous. And they shouldn't be able to state their profits as being net of the pittance that they pay to people in such countries. They should state their profits net of paying a true living wage throughout their supply chain. And they should refer to their costs as the costs of employing people in factories with sanitary and safe conditions. By so redefining the profits and performance of companies and then requiring companies to uphold proper living standards for their workers throughout their supply chain, we can transform the nature of the corporation in the 21st century. Now, of course, it will be argued that this will undermine the competitive position of British companies in the world. Well, that view is about as persuasive as the notion that the Factory Act was going to kill off British manufacturing at the beginning of the 19th century. It did no such thing, of course. In fact, it was the prelude to the emergence of those enlightened corporations to which I referred a bit earlier on. But we can go even further than this through reaffirming the nature of the corporate contract between government and business. One of the most interesting legislative developments that is currently going on is the emergence of what is termed the public benefit corporation in the United States. It's now swept across some 28 states in the United States. Public benefit corporations are required to state what is their public purpose and their social purposes alongside their commercial objectives. companies like Ben & Jerry and Patagonia are public benefit corporations. And the directors of those companies are responsible for ensuring that those companies uphold those public purposes. And if they fail to do so, then the investors can sue them for failing to do so and take out injunctive relief to stop them doing things that abuse their public purposes. Now, one area where this is particularly relevant in the context of the UK economy is in relation to its commanding heights, like its banks and its utilities, its airports and energy companies, telecom, transport companies, and water companies. At present, the only way we have of aligning the interests of those companies with a public purpose is through regulation. But the objectives of the regulator in upholding those public purposes is an exact contravention to what the companies are seeking to do in maximizing their profits. Well, transform them into public benefit corporations and make their public benefits the license conditions that they are required to fulfill as utilities or banks. And then you align the interests of those corporations with the public purpose as pursued by the regulators. Now, these are examples of the way in which not just companies, but regulators, politicians, and civil servants can transform the nature of the economy in which we are operating. And we need to inspire them to do exactly that, because this is the most important issue of the current decade. Without it, our economies will go on collapsing, our financial systems will continue to fail, and our environment will continue to degrade. With it, we can achieve higher levels of both economic and social well-being than has been possible to date. Because ultimately, a moral corporation is a commercially successful corporation, and the competitiveness of nations depends on the moral fiber of its corporations. Thank you.